Short rows. Won't be a musical, I promise. Okay. Hey all y'all, welcome back to my channel. My name is Carrie. This is where I talk about knitting, my tips, my tricks, my opinions, and my preferences. And today I'm going to show you another short row technique. I did a video on German double stitch, which I love. I love that technique for short rows, but there are other ones out there. There are other ones I even like using as much as German double stitch, and that's one of the ones I'm going to show you today. So if you want to learn how to do the shadow stitch or twin stitch short row, hit subscribe, hit the notification bell, give this video a thumbs up, and let's knit. I do love knitting short rows. Love it. I just think they're kind of magical. If you want to know the truth, I think it's so cool the way that taking a row of knitting and just doing part of the row and then coming back and then doing part of the row again and coming back and then doing the whole row and connecting the stitches all back up again can create these lovely curves in knitting that wouldn't otherwise exist. And I just think that's a really cool thing, and it's kind of magical. However, the thing with short rows is because when you knit a row, you're leaving stitches disconnected. You always end up with two stitches next to each other that aren't connected the way they would be otherwise with a running thread. You can end up with the gap. I have a whole video on this, by the way, whole video. I will link it up here. Hey there, Ed and Carrie here. So throughout the video, I use certain language and terms to explain short rows and what I'm doing. And if any of it is confusing to you or you don't know what I'm talking about, I really recommend that you do watch my video on short row structures. At the very least, the portion where I kind of break down what the verse, at least the portion where I break down what the various portions of a short row are and explain some of this terminology that I use. I will leave a link down in the description box that will take you to the part of the video that you may want to look at if you just want to know what I'm talking about in terms of some of these terms that I throw around. So today I'm going to show you how to do shadow stitch. Like, this is such a great, simple technique to do short rows. And it's one of those techniques that once again left me looking at wrap and turn and going, why do we still use wrap and turn? Because I've yet to find a reason that wrap and turn is a better, more desirable short row technique over other ones, other than it's just the first one a lot of us learn how to use. Without any further ado, let's jump into looking at how to do a shadow stitch short row. As always, I don't always say it, but as always, down in the description box, you will find timestamps to different parts of the video so you can skip around to, wherever you need to get to in the video. I always hope that you will watch the entire video at least once, because you never know what tip or trick or funny little bit might get thrown in to the video, but life is short and happening, and sometimes you gotta just get to the goods. So if you need to get to the goods, timestamps are down below. So here I have a sample. It's very small. We're going to look at how to do these shadow stitch short rows. So I have 20 stitches here. So I'm going to knit to 4 stitches before the end. And you'll get to see what this looks like, both doing a shadow stitch on a knit stitch and a purl stitch. Here I am, I have 4 stitches here at the end. So what I'm going to do, if this were a wrap and turn, or we're going to do wrap and turn, these 4 stitches are my left behind stitches. This is my anchor stitch here. This is the stitch that if I were doing wrap and turn, I would slip, bring my working yarn around it, slip it back, turn my work, and then purl back because I'm doing a stockinette stitch here. However, I don't want to do wrap and turn. I want to do shadow stitch. So instead of wrapping my working yarn around this stitch here, instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to work into the row below. So right here, this is my stitch. This is my anchor stitch. If I turn my work back, here's the purl bump. Right there, that's the purl bump that the stitch on my needle is coming out of. So I'm going to work into that purl bump. If you've ever done a lifted increase, this is going to look very familiar to you. So I'm going to take my right needle and jab it into that purl bump on the row below, wrap my yarn, pull the wrap through the purl bump, and move the wrap onto my left needle. Let's take a look at this in slow motion so you can really see what's happening. So there, I'm going to put my needle into the purl bump of the row below my anchor stitch. Wrap my yarn. I'm going to pull that wrap through that purl bump. And then just put the wrap up on my needle next to the anchor stitch. Now I just called it a stitch, but in truth, this here looks like a stitch, but it's not really a stitch. It's a wrap. But you'll look and you see this stitch now has 2 loops of yarn coming out of it. And that is why it's called shadow stitch or twin stitch, because this wrap of yarn is shadowing the stitch here, or it's acting like a twin. Now all I gotta do is turn my work and purl back. When I purl back, I'm going to purl to 4 stitches to the end. All right, here I am at 4 stitches to the end. Once again, these are my left behind stitches. This is my anchor stitch. The anchor stitch is the first stitch of the left behind stitches that will get worked with the wrap in order to close up any gaps. This time I want to purl into the stitch of the row below. This is always a little bit trickier. So here is my anchor stitch and it's coming out of this purl bump. Now on a knit stitch, all I really need to do is take my needle and jab it into the purl bump on the row below, but it's a little trickier to do that when you're working with the purl side. So what I'm going to do is take my right needle and use that to lift that purl bump up onto my left needle, like this. Now, one thing about when I lift my purl bump up on the needle is right now it's sitting in the eastern mount. All that means is that the right leg, which is right here, is sitting behind the needle. So I'm going to have to purl through the back of this stitch like that. Wrap my yarn around my needle, pull it through, let the purl bump drop back out. Now I'm going to take my left needle and slip that new stitch or that wrap back to my right needle. So there we go. Now you can see there's the 2 stitches coming out of the stitch on the row below. So it is a little, a little bit more action going on the purl side. Don't worry, I'm going to show you how I did that again in slow motion. So I use my right needle to insert into the purl bump below the anchor stitch, and then I bring that purl bump up on my needle into the eastern mount so that the right leg of the stitch below is to the back of the needle. And then I insert my right needle through the back leg so that I can purl through the back leg. I wrap my yarn, pull that wrap through the purl bump, let that purl bump drop off my needle, and then with my left needle, I transfer that new wrap back to my left needle next to my anchor stitch. And I'm having a little bit of struggle here doing it, but there we go. Got it done. And then I can turn my needles and I'm ready to knit my next short row. If that looks unfamiliar to you and you're like, I don't know what that looks like, you can take your left needle and you can pull it up and bring your right needle in front of the purl bump and slide it across and bring it up on your needle in that direction, because now that purl bump is sitting on your needle in the western mount, and you can just do a purl stitch as you normally would. And then slip that new stitch back to the left needle. Now that we've looked at how to work a shadow stitch for your short rows, let's look next at how we work the wraps and the anchor stitch together. I've completed all my short rows. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to count my short rows to make sure that I have all the ones I want. So if I want to count my short rows where I'm at, all I have to do is count my shadow stitches. So I have 1 shadow stitch, 2 shadow stitches. I have 3 shadow stitches and 4 shadow stitches. So I have 4 short rows all together. Yay! So now I'm going to go ahead and work my wraps. And this is a very simple thing. It's so simple in so simple with shadow stitch, how you work your wraps. So I'm going to just knit to my first shadow stitch. So here I am at my shadow stitch. Right here, this is my wrap. This is my anchor stitch, all right? And they look like 2 stitches. All I'm going to do to work my wrap and my stitch together is do a knit 2 together. Oops. So, boom, done. That's just 1 regular stitch. Oh, here's my next shadow stitch. Can't miss that. So obvious where it is, right? So I'm going to knit those 2 together, and boom, I have worked the wraps on that side of the knitting. And I have no gaps. Now I'm going to turn my work. And I'm going to purl back. And then I can work the wraps on the purl side. Okay, here's my next shadow stitch on the purl side. So all I'm going to do is purl 2 together. I just did a purl 2 together, but if you look on this side, it's a little more discernible on the right side that things look a little. I'm going to freeze frame here, so hopefully you can see what I'm talking about a little bit better. But what's going on here is where I worked that wrap and the original stitch together is when you do a purl 2 together, the wrap comes over the top of the original stitch and it becomes a less discreet working of the wrap and the stitch, the anchor stitch together. If you're okay with this result, great, do a purl 2 together. But if you want it to look a little bit more refined, you can do a left leaning decrease or a SSP, a slip as if to knit, slip as if to knit, purl 2 together through the back leg. So I'm going to slip as if to knit, slip as if to knit, bring that stitch back, bring those 2 stitches back onto my left needle. So this is still my wrap, this is my knit stitch. Now I'm going to purl through the back loop. Now to purl through the back loop, you bring your right needle behind the stitches and to the left side of them, and then you bring them through both stitches like this, and then work your stitch. Work, and then purl to the end. And now when you look, right here is where I did that, and it's much more refined than if I just did a purl 2 together. One of the things that I love about this technique, is how not futzy and fiddly it is. I'm going to turn the work over, and you tell me, Where are those wraps? Where are those wraps? Like, it's right, is that it? It's like right here. Like that's the first wrap. That's the first short row I did. That's the second one. But look how tidy that is. Like it almost disappears into the work. It's so tiny, the wraps in the end. I mean, they exist. They're there, right? But they're so small. And I personally, my experience with wrap and turn, working the wrap and the stitch together, I always find that the wrap ends up kind of like loose and loopy and just very obvious where those wraps were, where the turns were in the short row technique. And I've never loved it. Even if it's on the wrong side of the work and no one else is going to see it, it still bothers me personally. I love having tidy wraps. And I find that with this technique and German double stitch, I get those tidy wraps. Your mileage may vary. You know, everybody has their way of knitting. You got to find the techniques that work for you. But I got to say, I'm a big fan of the shadow stitch short row. All right, so next, let's talk about how we substitute shadow stitches for wrap and turn. Some people might be going, okay, great, this looks like a great technique, but patterns that I have for short rows call for wrap and turn. Can I use shadow stitch? Of course you can, because the truth is, all short rows are short rows. They're all short rows. A short row is a short row. And short row techniques are all, having a hard time talking today. All short row techniques are interchangeable with one another. You can substitute any short row technique for another one. Now, whether you should, depending on the circumstances of the knitting, is another question, because there are places where one technique might work better than another. But let's talk specifically about how you would go about thinking about substituting shadow stitch short row for a wrap and turn short row. And it's so simple. All you have to do is where it says wrap and turn, and you would wrap the yarn around the stitch. You just work in the row below instead. That's it. That's it. It's just, instead of wrapping the yarn around the anchor stitch, you knit into the purl bob below the anchor stitch. That's it. That's it. So very simple swap to do. One more thing I'm going to just quickly go over is with shadow stitch, what do you do if you accidentally drop a stitch and your shadow stitch comes undone? Like, holy schmollies. It can look very confusing, but I'm going to show you what to do in those circumstances. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to knit and I'm going to work my shadow stitch. But what happens if, say, I get here and I go, oh no, I dropped it. Holy crap, I dropped it. What do I do? First thing, first rule, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Universe, don't panic. So here's the stitch that I dropped. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my right needle, grab my stitch, and repair it by bringing my running stitch up and then pass the stitch over it. So now I've repaired that. But now what I need to see is I've got to find my loop of yarn, the wrap that was in this stitch. And if I look back right here, that doesn't look right, does it? Nope. That's the wrap. So I'm going to pull this wrap of yarn onto the needle. All right, so that's the wrap of yarn right there. Now, this wrap of yarn was coming out of this purl bump. Do I need to get this wrap of yarn back through this purl bump in order to fix the situation? And I can tell you right now, the answer is no. No, you don't. Because this wrap of yarn getting worked with this anchor stitch is what is going to close the gap. So as long as you find the wrap of yarn and you get it back up on your needle, you're fine, okay? So if it looks like this, it might look crazy, it might look strange, but you're fine, because all you have to do when it's time to work these stitches together, here's my wrap, here's my anchor stitch, I just do a knit two together to work them together. And it's like I never dropped the stitch at all. So it's very, and look, no gap, everything's fine. And I can just continue knitting to the end. So it can look very strange, and this is where it's very helpful to take some time and see what looks wrong. Take time to learn what things are supposed to look like so that you can identify what's my anchor stitch, where's that wrap, so that if you run into a situation like this, you can repair it very easily. So there it is, the shadow stitch short row technique. I love this technique. It's really straightforward. It's not futzy at all. Kind of hits all my buttons in terms of a technique that I love. Are there cons to it? Yeah, sure, there are cons to it. I'd say the biggest con to this is if you want to do a short row technique to close gaps, if you're working garter stitch, the thing that you have to be aware of is that the purl bump on the row below is going to be facing you on the right side of the fabric because it's garter stitch. And so you, trust me, I've made this mistake. I've made it. You work into the purl bump of the row below. So on garter stitch, that purl bump is facing you. And I don't know, I just always find it's a little trickier to do that. I just don't love the look of it at the end. I just prefer to go ahead and use German double stitch. I find that shadow stitch works really well for more stockinette based fabrics than garter stitch based fabrics, but your mileage may vary. Outside of that, the purl side, I think German double stitch, when it comes to having short rows on the purl side of a fabric, is a little bit more straightforward, because really ideally with shadow stitch, if you're going to have those short rows on the purl side, you're going to want to do the SSP, the slip as if to knit, purl through the back loop together. Some people don't love doing that. It's not always ideal. It's actually why a lot of times with sock knitting and short row heels, I tend towards German double stitch over twin stitch or shadow stitch. That's, again, a matter of personal preference. I would love to hear from you. What are your favorite short row techniques? Have you used shadow stitch? Do you love it? Do you loathe it? I'd love to hear about it down in the comments down below. What is your favorite short row technique? Do you have an argument to me about how I have wrap and turn all wrong and it's great? I would love to hear that argument. I really would, because I love learning from all of you. I hope that you enjoyed today's video. If so, please make sure to give it a thumbs up. Share it with your friends. Liking videos, commenting in videos, sharing videos with other people lets YouTube know that this is a space we're checking out, and it is a totally free way to help support my channel. And thank you to everybody who has subscribed or has bought me a coffee or used one of my affiliate links. It is so greatly, greatly appreciated. I think that's it for today. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope that you have a wonderful day, evening, weekend, weeknight, whenever you may be watching this. And as always, happy health and happy crafting. Bye. Moving this right along now. Moving it, moving it, moving it, moving it, moving it right along. Short and snappy, short and snappy. People want short and snappy, keep it organized. Short rows, short rows. I like to do short rows. I like to knit part of a row and not have a gap when I finish it. Short rows the musical. By the way, if you're not ready to leave, you'd like to spend some more time with me here at Carrie CraftGeek, my little corner of YouTube. At the end, a couple of videos will pop up, suggestions. You can click on them and enjoy another video. But if you're like, I gotta go, I gotta run, I got a life, I understand, I do too. I'm still here. I'm always here. And you've got one more chance to hit subscribe. Down in the corner, there's a picture of me. You can click on it and subscribe to my channel. And yeah, and come back. You're always welcome to come back. All right. Okay, I really gotta go now.